Hello bearded bee people, welcome back to Being KBs for another episode of our beekeeping crash course. This is a super important one because it's going to cover both splitting and combining hives, which is something that you should really become familiar with during your first couple years as a beekeeper. I mean, it's really an essential set of tools that can help you prevent yourself from losing bees to swarms and over the winter. So yeah, let's just get right into it because there's a lot to cover. So there are a bunch of different published methods of splitting your beehive. Some of them are logical, simple, and they just work. And some of them are contrived and sort of meant to just sell a beekeeper or a beekeeper's methods rather than to offer a practical benefit to you. So I'm not going to get into any of those super special methods. I'm going to talk about the three categories of splitting, which is splitting with a queen cell, splitting with a mated queen, or walkaway splits. And then in those categories, I'm going to talk about 4 different overall methods of splitting your bees. They should be pretty straightforward, but of course, as is true with any other video, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below, and I will be happy to chat with you about them there. So, like I said, there are 3 different categories of splits. Splitting with a queen cell, splitting with a mated queen, and walkaway splits, and we're going to talk about all of those here. So some things to understand before we get into the how-to of splitting is, firstly, foragers aren't nurse bees, and nurse bees aren't foragers. As we found out in previous sections of this crash course, bees graduate to different types of jobs, different duties in their hive depending on how old they are. So when bees first emerge from the cell, they're house bees, and then they're going to graduate to doing like entrance duty, and then they'll graduate to doing forager stuff, and so they go through this succession of jobs as they go throughout their life. And an unfortunate aspect of things is once they leave that section of their job or of their life, they don't do that job that they used to do very well. So once again, foragers don't do nurse bee duty very well, and nurse bees don't do forager duty very well at all either. So you have to understand that when you're setting out your splits. And why I say that is if you set out a split with just capped brood, so brood that's going to emerge within the next couple of days, but you set it out as a walkaway split or with a queen cell or something, there's going to be a time when there's no brood in that hive and nothing but foragers, because all of that capped brood has since emerged and graduated onto forager duty, while that queen that is now coming into fruition is starting to build a brood nest. And the problem that that poses is you only have foragers in there and you've got a brood nest that needs to be taken care of by nurse bees. And the result of that is you're going to end up having underfed, smaller house bees walking out for that first generation or two. The way you can avoid that is by giving all of your splits brood of all stages, from eggs to very, very old capped larvae or capped brood ready to emerge. And then also to just sort of pay attention to the population levels of your splits as they're going through the split process so that you can be ready to supplement with nurse bees if you need to. And then if you only have nurse bees, if you only set out a split with nothing but nurse bees, during that first while before they graduate to forager duty, you're going to either have to make sure that they have food inside the hive or feed them, because once again, they're not going to be doing a great job of getting out and gathering nectar and bringing it back to sustain the colony through a very important time. So understand, foragers are not nurse bees, and they don't do nurse bee duty very well, and nurse bees don't do forager duty at all. So understand that and you'll be fine, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the specific methods. Another thing to keep in mind is splitting too early or too thin is a dangerous game. And the reason that I say this is because I think that the majority of people, when they get started off with bees, are so excited and they want more bees, and then they learn how to split a hive. And I'm saying they, but I mean me. So I got bees and I got obsessed. And then I learned how to split bees, and my eyes just, you know, instead of having dollar signs in them, I had bees in my eyes, and that's all I could think of. So I got split happy over the course of the next few years and created many issues for myself as a result of that. So what I'm saying is use caution when you're setting out your splits. Don't set them out too early when the nights are still very cold, and don't set them out too thin where they don't have the ability to take care of all of the stuff they have in their hive and to defend the entire cavity of their hive. So try not to get too split happy. As you get better at splitting and more experienced at beekeeping, you'll be able to really fine tune that and figure out exactly how thin you can make them. But in the meantime, before you have all of that experience and can feel totally confident in doing that, err on the side of more rather than less, and later rather than earlier in terms of when in the beekeeping season you're splitting. Okay, so splitting with a mated queen. The general concept is that you need to divide your hive in resources, bringing off enough bees, brood, and food to a new location. Now that location doesn't have to be miles away, it can be just a few feet away, but once again be mindful of the fact that the foragers are going to return to the old location, leaving the split you moved to the new spot free of foragers. There's no foragers in there at all, so you have to have food in that hive or be splitting that portion. So in the ideal circumstance, what you're doing is moving the queen and the bees, brood, and food off to the new location so that she can have the ability to continue to grow the colony that's going to lose all of the numbers, and you can have your queenless portion be the one being bolstered by the returning foragers. So make sure that both halves have brood of all stages, and make sure that both halves have a proper amount of food to where they're not going to starve out before they have the ability to start replenishing via foraging. In addition to all that, you just basically have to follow the instructions that the Maintaining a Queen Right Hive video gave you on installing a queen. So to the queenless portion, what that means is that you leave them for a day, for 24 hours, for that queen mandibular pheromone to completely dissipate out of the hive. And now these bees know that they are queenless and they're ready to accept a queen. So 24 hours later, you come back in, you install your queen exactly as is stated in that Maintaining a Queen Right Hive video, and then you can treat your other portion as a Queen Right Hive and add it to your regular inspection schedule. And then 4 days after installing the queen in the queenless portion, you're going to get in, you're going to remove that queen cage, and you're going to make sure that she got out and is doing what she's doing. And then you can wait 10 days to have the chaos threat diminish. Because once again, if you continue to get into this hive as they're getting to know their new queen, the chaos that the bees sort of consider, you tearing the hive apart, can be blamed on the queen, and you can see immediate supersedure cells. So give them a full 10 days after removing that queen cage, and then after that you can add this to your normal inspection schedule. Splitting with a queen cell is almost exactly the same process. You're going to want to move the queen and enough bees, brood, and resources off to a new location and leave the parent hive, the original hive, queenless for a full day. After that full 24 hours, and they're now very aware of the fact that they're queenless, you can install a queen cell. Now, if you got your queen cell from a reputable queen breeder, you'll understand that that should emerge within the next day or two, and if that happens, that's just awesome. She's going to emerge, and she's going to spend the next probably couple of weeks gaining her strength and maturity before she goes out onto a mating. So after those couple of weeks after installing that queen cell, of course you can get in after those first couple of days to make sure that she emerged from the cell. That's completely okay. And then after 2 weeks after installing the cell, or after she had emerged, you can start inspecting regularly to be aware of the fact that she came back from her mating flight and has started to lay eggs and build a brood nest. So once again, the process is almost exactly the same as splitting with a mated queen, There's just that little period after she emerges from the cell and before she gets mated that she's not going to be developing any brood inside the hive. All right, now a walkaway split. Let me make sure I'm still recording before I continue. Okay, so walkaway splits are the first style of split most people learn, and they're it's a great way to split your bees. Not only does it help you make more hives in your yard, but it also helps to break the brood cycle, which can really put a wrench in those mites' plans, because the mites need open brood cells to continue creating more mites. And if there's a period during the bee season when our hives don't have any open brood cells, that's a period in which those mites cannot continue to propagate. And during that period, there's some natural mite fall, there's some natural mite death, and that little hitch in the mite population growth can often be something really good for your bees. So I highly recommend performing a walkaway split on your hives once a year. But either way, though, let's talk about how you do that here. So this is a split, essentially, where you are going to let your bees create their own queen. So the concept is that you're going to take some brood and resources, the same way you were before with the mated queen or the queen cell, set them off into a new location, and make sure that the queenless portion has fresh eggs and young larvae. If that's the case, then they're going to create queen cells and before too long have a queen. So first we'll talk about how to do a walkaway split without finding your queen. It's by far the easiest method of splitting your bees that there could ever possibly be. And if you want a direct demonstration of me working with live bees on that, I have a video. It's called How to Split Your Beehive the Easy Way. It's the most popular video on this channel, so it's super easy to find. If you go to the main channel page, it should be right there. So let's talk about it. But once again, if you want to see me actually doing it with bees, there's that How to Split Your Beehive the Easy Way video. So before performing a walkaway split where you don't find your queen, you're really going to have to understand what it takes to make queens, but not only what it takes to make queens, what it takes to make good queens. And that is, you need a queenless hive with tons of nurse bees and tons of food. If they are queenless and they have all that workforce and all that food, and you make sure that they have eggs and young larvae, which is the genetic material with which they can make a queen, then they're going to create queen cells. They're going to create a bunch of them, and if they have enough bees and enough food, they're going to create a bunch of really well-fed queen cells. So that's the situation we have to put our bees in, so they're going to create some really nice, fat, well-fed queen cells for us. And to do that, essentially what you're going to do is find a very large hive, a hive that is ready to be split, and just split the resources right down the middle. Make sure that half the food and half the bees and half the brood and everything just gets split right down the middle and set off into their, don't move the parent hive, but move the one off to the side. Of course, you're going to once again have to make sure that that population in the one you move is okay about a day later, because there's going to be foragers returning to this portion. But the only other thing that you have to make certain of is that both halves have eggs and young larvae. If that's the case, then the portion with the queen, they're just going to continue on as if nothing had happened. The portion without the queen, they're going to they are going to start to create queen cells, because they're very aware of the fact that they're now queenless. So after you've done that, a day later, like I said, after you set the splits out, get in both halves and make sure that the population doesn't need adjusting, because it might, because those foragers will return. Now, after that, about 3 days later, so 4 days after setting your splits out, get in and pull a couple of central frames. Now, obviously, pull the outside frames out first, so you're not rubbing any frames up against the other ones. But what you want to do is look at one of the central brood frames. And so you'll do that in both portions, and the queenless portion is going to be extremely easy to find at this time, because they're going to have a bunch of queen cells that are starting to get created. The queen right portion is not going to have queen cells at all, but rather they will have eggs, where the queen had laid eggs over the last couple of days. So you've inspected 4 days after setting out your walkaway split, and you now know which half has the queen and which half doesn't. The queen right portion, once again, is going to be added to your regular inspection schedule, and the queen less portion can be added to your regular inspection schedule in about 18 days, 17 or 18 days. So what you really want to allow is enough time for that queen to emerge and enough time for that queen to have matured and strengthened, because you really don't need to get in there while she's a virgin running around. There's almost nothing you can do at that time. Virgins are very small and they're also quite flighty, so if you pull a frame out with a virgin on it, there's a real chance that she might just take off for a second, and that can be a real problem, especially if she's not oriented to the spot. So wait 3 weeks after setting out your walkaway split and then start inspecting it on your normal schedule. You're likely to have a virgin queen at that time, but she'll be more matured and almost ready to start going out on her mating flight. You won't lose her, and she might be even easier to find at that time because she's lengthened a little bit. Regardless of all that, you'll start to inspect every week or 10 days with the expectation that in one of those early inspections, you're going to start finding eggs. So queens will normally leave on their mating flight around 2 weeks after emerging from her cell. And she was going to emerge from the cell 12 days after you set your split out. And you probably wonder, how the heck do you know that? Well, I know that because when you give a queenless hive brood, they are going to start making queen cells with 1-day-old larvae. They understand that that's the optimal age to start creating queens with, and they will always create queens with that 1-day-old larvae. So now that we know that that has 4 days from being laid, if you add 12 more days to that, we've got 16, and that's the day she's going to walk out. So 12 days after setting your split out, she's going to walk out of her cell, and within 2 weeks after that, she's probably going to go out and get mated. So once again, wait about 3 weeks after setting your split out, and you can start inspecting and looking for signs that your new queen has gone out and got mated. So if you know where the queen is, say if you were inspecting or while you were pulling all the frames out and setting out your walkaway split, you found your queen, the only difference that I would recommend to you is that you move your queen off to the new location. The only reason for that is because the foragers will return and bolster the queenless half, and also because it will kind of more accurately mimic a swarm and reduce the need for either portion to swarm later in the year. Okay, and then this brings us into the swarm simulation split, which is any of those other methods as long as you pull the queen to the new location. And that's really it. That's all you have to do. During the swarm portion of the year, during May and June here in Michigan, the bees understand that our main goal is to spread genetics. In doing that, we have to send out a swarm. So their main goal during that portion of the year is to send bees and their old queen out to a new location. And if you split and do exactly that, that can be just enough to convince both halves that they've done what they need to do in terms of swarming. Okay, so now that we've talked about taking one hive and making 2 or more out of it, and you can make more than 1 out of a split, but I don't recommend doing it that way when you're first starting out. But so now that we've talked about taking 1 and making more, let's talk about taking a few and making 1. And obviously that's not a goal, it's not something we want to do, but it is an essential thing to be able to do because firstly, in the fall, it's a likely situation that you've got a dud. You've got a straggler that just didn't quite get up to the level that they need to be, whether that be in population or overall weight. Do have those stragglers or duds in the fall. My advice is to take your losses in the fall by combining that with another hive to create something that has a better chance of going through the winter. I mean, if you do that, you can split that one hive back into 2 in the spring and not have lost your hive numbers, as opposed to trying to send both halves through the winter and possibly losing both. So combining hives is an essential thing to know how to do. It's not difficult at all, and so let's talk about it here. So bees from different hives, especially forager bees, are going to fight with each other. Nurse bees just kind of sort of work, and they just do what they're supposed to do. So they're not really all big into the politics. But the foragers are well aware of the politics, and they are going to fight. So the real issue is, if you're combining two queen-right hives, you have to understand that the stronger portion's queen is the one that's going to make it through the fight. Another thing to understand is, if those halves that you're combining are equal strength, then that's going to be quite a damaging fight. So when you are combining hives of similar strength, I recommend take the smaller one, put it on top of the larger one, divided by 2 sheets of newspaper. Now, if you put those 2 sheets of newspaper in between them, that forces them to have to eat and tear away at that newspaper before they can get to the act of fighting, and that allows for the scents to linger and for them to become more like aware and comfortable with each other, and that diminishes the amount of fighting to a great degree. Now, I don't do a whole lot of newspaper combinations anymore, and the reason for that is I'm usually adding a small hive to a larger hive, and in that instance, I just set it right on top. The smaller hive doesn't put up too much of a fight, and usually it goes really, really smoothly. You don't see a bunch of dead bees. You don't hear a crazy amount of fighting. You always come out with a queen if the larger portion is queen right. And so yeah, if you're adding a larger or a smaller one to a larger one, just set it right on top and don't worry about it. If you're adding something of similar strength, separate them by 2 sheets of newspaper, and they'll eat through that newspaper and everything will be just fine. Okay, so next up is seasonal hive management. It should be some good information, stuff you should be doing in the fall and in the summer. And wait, no, that's not how the year goes. Stuff you should be doing in the spring, summer, and fall. So I hope you're digging it. Thanks very much for watching. Get out there and have some fun with your bees.